when you say incel, I feel like you mostly mean abiding to incel ideology, which to me would be like a black pillar.
I have left it up to the interpretation of the incel, how they want to define
Mm-hmm.
incel. I take a fairly liberal definition of basically anyone who is involuntarily celibate, um, whether or not they endorse, the black pill ideology is another question. There's a study not that long ago that asked incels like, what criteria do you think other people need to have or meet to be considered an incel? And only half of them said that you need to endorse the black pill.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a larger proportion of those people being surveyed actually did endorse it or elements of it, but they don't necessarily see that as absolutely mandatory, which is why I don't view it as, an ideological movement. It's something that's basically situational. And when I asked incels in my interviews, I asked every single one of them, okay, well, what is an incel? What does that mean? And they basically all defined it as a circumstance. They didn't define it as an ideology. Many of them didn't endorse the black pill. They said, well, it's just, it's like anything else, right? It's like, I know your height or whether you're diabetic or not or something like that. It's just you are something or you haven't experienced something. Um, and that's just the way it is.
Yeah,
So
I
I accepted
definitely,
that definition.
yeah, I would definitely agree with that definition. But then in the scientific research that I mean, I feel like sometimes it's being used in a different way. Because if,
It's definitely implied that it's referring to individuals, and that's right, and that's my challenge, right? Is that they're often painted with a broad brush, and I'm trying to say this is actually, like many groups, it's very heterogeneous. There's going to be individuals who absolutely are pro-violence, are very black-pilled, and there's going to be others that don't feel that way at all.
yeah, so
Um,
because sometimes I read in the paper, incels statistically have a higher, have big issues of finding partners, as if that is a synthetic judgment, like as if that is adding new information. And that would be the case if incels are people that are abiding to the, that are self-identifying as incels, right? That would be a meaningful statement. But if it's already in the definition, then that would be a weird statement. So sometimes I'm really like wondering which definition is being used here. You know what I mean? So because if you were using that definition of a state, part of that state is not finding a romantic partner, right? So we cannot make like that statement would be a tautological statement. So yeah, that's why that's
Well,
what's
I mean,
confusing me a
yes and
little bit.
no, because there's also the question of what if this is just perception, right? What if incels say, man, you know what? I am having way less success than the average man. I mean, man, it's been 2 years since my last sexual encounter or something like that. And then imagine we ran a study and we found out that actually that's the average for all men. They're just perceiving their reality a little bit differently. That's obviously very different than saying, yeah, actually, it's been a lot longer for them, or they've had way fewer sexual partners than non-incel men. So I don't think it's entirely tautological. It's something that we need to figure out. Is this just a problem with their perception
Mm-hmm.
or actual reality? And
Yeah.
that's something I found in my first paper where I asked about, their dating app experiences. And, while you're still getting them to estimate, they said that they were matching with women on dating apps about 5% of the time. Um, and non-incel men said they were matching about a third of the time. Well, that's a big difference, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so And it's interesting because when you ask incels, how often do you think other men are matching? They guessed that it was around 33%. So their perception was actually pretty accurate, in that they are matching considerably less. And the proportion that rated, you know, how often are you talking to women on dating apps and how often have you gone on a date via dating apps, etc. All kind of confirms that this isn't just a a misaligned perception of their reality. It is, in fact, their objective reality. They are doing worse, or they are less successful on dating apps across all of the metrics.
Yeah,
So
that's the only.
it's not in their head.
Yeah, so the only way that it's not tautological is basically if they have a completely delusional way of seeing basically reality, then that would, yeah, that's true.
And that's a possibility. Like, I mean, I don't think
It
it's the
is.
case, but you can imagine, let's say we know this group, right? The same study and others have said that they have higher rates of depressive symptoms, right? So you imagine someone who is very depressed, right? They're probably going to be quite pessimistic, and that might impact their view of, how often they're romantically engaged with someone, or how successful they are in the dating market. So that has the power to alter their perception of that, but it doesn't seem like that's what's driving this. It sounds like this actually is their reality. They just aren't doing as well. So, that is, like you said, it's not tautological, because there were other possibilities that might explain it, but I don't think
It
um,
would be tautological for a sane person, right?
for someone with a full,
If you,
that we knew going into it, had a healthy view of reality.
yeah.
Yeah, you probably wouldn't be worried about whether or not um, the way they described something was accurate or not. We didn't know anything about incels, and here they are claiming to be something very different, um, in terms of, like, we differ from the general population extremely in some way. Is that because that's true, or is it because of the way in which they're interpreting their reality?
Again, there seems to be a big bias here that the first thing we do is we check whether, where in other, I feel like in other fields of study or in other cases, we would just take it as face value, that if they say that they are not successful with women, then okay, we just take it for face value, and then and in so many areas we just take it for granted what people tell us in studies and stuff like that. And in this case, we first have to check if they're saying the truth. And I think that was done in the second time, where you had, I'm not sure if it was your paper. I'm sorry, I read so many papers in
Okay.
last weeks, but there was another one where perceived mating value was a high predictor of inceldom.
Yeah, that was me. Yeah.
And I was like, yeah, if that person isn't crazy, obviously, right? Like if you're getting rejected the whole day, then obviously you're going to rank your perceived mating value low, except if you are delusional and if you think your perceived mating value is really high, but no one likes you, then you don't even understand what mating value means, right? So that would be like that would be crazy. So I feel like that there again, basically we're just testing for complete loss of reality, and I feel like that's, I don't know, I don't feel like that's warranted to do. Do you agree?
Well, the reason I did the first study was I had kind of, I guess, predicted, because again, like, the first I'd heard of incels was, Elliot Rodger and all of that. And I said, if I just stroll in to the incel forums and say, hey guys, do you want to fill out this survey on incels and violence so I can go publish a paper on it? They weren't going to be very keen on that. So I said, okay, what would be a study in which they would actually get behind? Um, And when I thought about it, I thought, we started to hear more and more about incels around the same time we saw dating apps increasing in popularity. So my thinking was, do they have some sort of relationship, right? Because you think about traditionally dating, well, you might have to meet people through friends, you might have to, run into someone at a supermarket, what have you. With dating apps, you can download an app. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of people that will pop up immediately. And even if you're remotely popular, right? We'll say the average male from my study, and they match a third of the time. That's still a lot of rejection they're getting in a really short window. Now imagine you're only matching 5% of the time. So out of every 20 women that you swipe right on, you're only matching with one of them. That's a lot of rejection in a really short period of time. And I think there's probably a belief that the dating apps are capturing most of the eligible people kind of in your geographic area. So, we're not used to that. We're not used to having, all the options out there, cards are on the table, and it's not looking too good. So I wondered if that made it more apparent. And that's why we saw more just incels becoming more prominent. Now, there's no real way to prove that, but that was kind of the framing that went into it. So I didn't go in skeptical of their claims. I was more wondering, okay, well, how much
But
difference?
you were trying to mitigate their skepticism.
No, I know what I mean is
That's what it sounded
they
like when you
say that
said they
they
wouldn't
are,
get
I don't know,
behind.
less popular than other men on dating apps. Okay, that might be true, that might not be true.
Mm-hmm.
But if they are less popular, if I found out they were 10% less popular, it might not be like that earth shattering, right? You'd be like, okay, well, really, you're 10% less and you're forming this whole group and identity around this. That's kind of, you know, um, how do I interpret that?
But they're saying
I
zero.
know it's a massive difference. All of a sudden you go, okay, there really is something here. And we've had some verification of what they're claiming. So it's also tough because realistically, it's not like I've been around for the advent of other types of research to know like what was the first study on intimate partner violence. I don't know. Um, some of it probably was going into validating claims that were made, right? Maybe on the prevalence or something like that. Um, so it's not so much that we are skeptical or unwilling to take it at face value, but until someone actually goes out and objectively finds it in a study, I can't really talk about it as a justification for my study, right? So if I didn't do that first study, other people would have a harder time being able to justify a study looking at, let's say, incels dating experiences because there was no scientific evidence to say that, hey, they actually do experience or they actually do worse on dating apps. So you still need to find some sort of scientific piece of work that sometimes states the obvious, and you would be surprised how hard that is sometimes to find because sometimes that is kind of glossed over, and then you're going, okay, well, I need to find an article to say this thing that I already know because there's a whole field on this, and then you go, wait a minute, there's nothing quite exactly there. And so I'm hoping that this helps launch more of a foundation for saying, hey, look, we know this. Now there's a springboard to jump in and focus more on this rather than because otherwise your only real hope would be citing either a news article that kind of mentions it or maybe some research that's been on a forum analysis that mentions that. But most of the forum analyses don't really focus on those elements. So without that scientific basis there, that scientific foundation, you're limited as to how far down that road you can go in terms of your lines of inquiry.
Next to these seeming like for me they look like tautologies to a certain extent, but then other ones are like quasi tautologies to that extent, to because there are basically things like incels are more depressed. When you find something like that, and you also know that being without a partner and socially isolated, and society is basically not also so kind to incels and stuff like that. Basically, like, it's not really, no one is like mind blown when they hear incels are more depressed, right? And it's not even like serving us to us as a predictor, or like we're not able to, yeah, we can't basically do anything with that information, so it's almost a tautology, you know what I mean? Like, it's not really, but you know what I mean, right?
I mean, just because something is not surprising doesn't mean it's tautological. And
No, it doesn't mean that. That's why I said quasi.
so, and I mean, again, this is important because if the only evidence we had that incels have or are depressed is some forum posts that talk about it, I think it's also something that could be dismissed, right? As, oh, well, there's maybe just a few vocal incels that have depression, or maybe it's subjective, etc. If you can find that across different methodologies and it's consistent, then you've got a stronger foundation to say, actually, this is an area that we should be investing more time and efforts in.
No, I
Um,
agree. I agree. But you always have to question with these types of findings. You always have to you also mention it in your papers. You always have the question of chicken and egg, right? And
yes,
what
yes.
there is basically directly with that information, there is no way to know if which came first. So that's why I mean it's quasi tautological because of this chicken and egg situation. Uh, so that's but for example, there was one finding. There were basically two findings that really surprised me. Where one was about autism, that autism was really high, and
Hmm.
there we know that there is no chicken and egg situation because we've never heard of a case where inceldom has caused autism. And the other one was being being a virgin in high school, I think. I don't know. I don't think that it was. I'm not sure in which paper I read this, but I read that being a virgin in high school was a really high predictor of inceldom in, like, at the end of, or I don't know if it was high school or college. It was one of the two. Sorry, I'm not really. Uh, I'm sometimes
That's
just
fine.
picking my own brain. Maybe you know more about it. But basically, that also coincides with what many incels are reporting. Is basically that they at some point basically check out of the normal development that people have, and that also coincides with your finding that people are more and more, less and less sexually, children or adolescents are less and less sexually active and lose their virginity later. And if, yet now my question is, the data that you have linked was not doing any distinction between girls and boys. Is there any data on if boys are more affected from that?
I don't. Yeah, that the article that I was citing, I think was just was across gender. So I don't think
Mm-hmm.
that, that's just happening with one and not the other. But that was also something, you kind of think about, like you said, incels feel that they're kind of missing some of those developmental milestones in a sense, right? Like, first kiss, maybe first girlfriend or boyfriend, losing your virginity, those types of things, all at certain age points. And they're missing those. Um, we also have this sort of cultural context in the background, right? Of like, even stuff like, it's now been 60 something years since, like um, like the free love 60s where everyone seemed to be, doing their thing and very sexually liberal. Um, and there's lots of movie tropes about people being like very, very sexual in high school, and in university or college. Um, so there's those kind of expectations that society has out there, and then that's actually becoming less and less true over time. So that's going to be difficult, I think, if you're going into, say, university expecting it to be like the movies, when actually it's not like that at all. So there's an expectation. There's a big difference between expectation and reality, which, might be difficult. And some people may struggle with that more than others, especially those that are kind of doing even less than, say, the average person. And the average person's already not meeting those kind of maybe expectations they had. So, some people are going to respond to that a little bit differently. You're right, like with the chicken and egg situation, keeping in mind when we're doing these studies and we're throwing everything into a single equation, that can't predict things over time. That's predicting things in that particular study with data all collected at the same time to see which variable might have some sort of uniqueness to it, that others don't, right? Because there's going to be a big overlap between depression and anxiety and some other things. So what unique elements predict, inceldom? Depression didn't. That doesn't mean that it's not important. That doesn't mean that that might not have contributed to it, or might come after the fact. Who knows? But that just means that it didn't have any unique characteristics that its overlap with something else couldn't also account for. So that also runs the issue. If you run a regression with really like 4 really similar variables and then one that's very different, it might emerge just because it's kind of its own unique thing. So that's just something to keep in mind with some of those studies.
Yeah, I feel like they're more designed to identify incels rather than I mean,
Then to explain how they became incels.
Yeah. Or to mitigate that situation.
Yeah. And I mean, if you're a clinician working with an incel, it's important to know that, on average, they might be a bit more likely to have depressive symptoms and anxious symptoms and self-esteem issues, attachment issues. But ultimately, you've got to treat them as an individual. They might not have depressive symptoms at all for whatever reason. And obviously you're not going to treat them for it just because as a population they have higher rates. So, you still need to use your clinical skills. But it can be helpful to know going into it, some of the issues that might be present in them.